June 4, 1942. Midway Atoll. Dawn broke like a bruise over the North Pacific, a low, hard light that painted the lagoon a cold, metallic green. The water lay flat and deceptive. The air smelled of salt and diesel, edged with the acrid tang of aviation fuel. On the horizon, four great silhouettes drifted into view. The carriers of the Imperial Japanese Navy, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, spread in a loose diamond, their flight decks a mosaic of men, aircraft, and canvas tarps, as if the fleet itself were a sleeping animal barely breathing. Aboard Akagi, Admiral Nagumo walked the deck with his staff like a somber conductor. The day was humid. Sweat beaded beneath his cap as he paused to peer through a pair of binoculars at the tiny specks of ocean that might be American carriers. Radios whispered in corners. Men moved with that peculiar efficiency you find in great machines, quiet, purposeful, as if they too sensed something monumental coming. Scout planes had reported faint contacts the night before. It was now Nagumo's responsibility to turn those hints into action. Below decks, ordnance crews stirred. Bomb racks clanked. Crates of 250 and 500-pound bombs were cracked open, fuses checked and rechecked. The carrier decks, normally a place of disciplined choreography, had taken on an edge of hectic urgency. At 0600, men worked beneath shaded tarps, sweating and blackened by grease as they readied aircraft that would either secure a landing on Midway or strike at enemy carriers, depending on Nagumo's orders. The crucial detail, the one that would thrum through the rest of the day like a bell, was this. Many of the planes on deck were armed for a land strike against Midway Island. Their bomb racks and fuel tanks were set, their pilots briefed for a different target than the one the rising sun might reveal. From a distance, the American task forces were tiny, almost anonymous, two carrier groups separated by hundreds of miles of empty sea. But in Washington and Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz had placed his few remaining carriers like knives in the dark. His submarine nets and picket planes had not found the Japanese fleet, but his intelligence men had. Intercepts, code-breaking, months of patient work had given Nimitz a sliver of vision. The Japanese planned to seize Midway. The Admiral's confidence was a long, cold thing that cut through the Pacific fog. He had placed his bets, and now he waited for the hand to be played. Back on Kaga's flight deck, lieutenants barked into megaphones. Mechanics rolled Corsairs. No, not Corsairs yet. A-6M0s and D-3A Val dive bombers into position. They adjusted guns, checked oil pressure, mounted bombs. The carriers smelled of hot metal and human sweat, of oiled canvas and burnt cordite. Flight control shouted for clear decks. Pilots tightened their straps and glanced at their comrades, faces shadowed by helmets and resolve. At 0720, the first real movement, a scouting report over encrypted radio. It spoke of enemy carriers east of the reported position, 3, possibly 4, a report that sent a ripple through Nagumo's command. He filed the information silently, his staff murmured. The problem had always been a problem with time and ordnance. To strike land targets hardened with concrete and anti-aircraft emplacements required heavy bombs. To strike enemy carriers at sea called for torpedoes and armor-piercing gear and a different set of aircraft altogether. Arming planes for one purpose left them dangerously unprepared for the other. Nagumo's face was a closed mask. He ordered a holding pattern, launched the search aircraft, recover what would return, maintain readiness. If you stood on the carrier rails at that moment, you could taste the tension. The men moved like a single organism, efficient, trained, and yet unervingly human. Pilots ran their hands over their bomber wings, laughed too loudly to cover the trembling, or stared fixedly at the horizon. Below, in the ammunition pits, the men who would decide the fate of empires with a spanner or a torch worked in careful silence. At 0915, the first contact report flashed across the bridge, a sighting by a Japanese scout, 3 enemy carriers, bearing west. A new calculus began. Nagumo called his officers closer. Maps were unrolled, flags shifted. He ordered a strike, but not the rapid, all-or-nothing launch that would cripple an enemy carrier fleet. Instead, he selected a conservative approach, launch bomb-armed aircraft to finish the capture of Midway and hold back other groups while he consolidated his position. It was a choice rooted in intelligence that emphasized certainty over risk, but that very caution would become the seed of catastrophe. On the U.S. side, Vice Admiral William Halsey's aides scratched notes. Vice Admiral Raymond Spruance and Rear Admiral Frank J. Fletcher, the Americans commanding the two carrier groups, were making decisions with a different currency, limited resources, and the sudden, razor-sharp opportunity that code-breaking had afforded them. U.S. carrier decks were also a whirl of activity, but their ordnance crews had been briefed for ship-to-ship combat, torpedoes and armor-piercing loads lying ready. By mid-morning, the Japanese carriers were a dazzling hive of activity, aircraft being fueled, rearmed, and swung into position. The sound of engines warmed up into a roar that filled the air like a swarm. Up above, gulls wheeled and cried. Below, the sea reflected the sky without a ripple. On the bridge, Nagumo watched the decks with a fixedness that betrayed no panic, only the weight of a decision that might tilt the Pacific itself. Then, somewhere between orders and execution, between the smell of avgas and the nervous shouts of flight control, fate began to narrow. The Japanese admirals felt at first as a tension in the voice of a subordinate, a delayed report, a carrier returning with bombs still mounted, a small mismatch in a day that would demand perfection. They did not yet know the magnitude of what was approaching. They only felt the frisson, the thin, electric sense of history about to snap. At 10:20 a.m., the Pacific sky above Midway erupted into chaos. The Japanese carriers were turning into the wind, decks slick with spilled aviation fuel, aircraft poised for launch. The hum of engines had become a roar so deep it rattled in the ribcage. On Akagi's flight deck, armorers shouted final checks. The first Zero was already taxiing forward when the cry went up. Dive bombers. Incoming. From the east. Every head turned skyward. What had been an empty expanse moments before was now alive with silver shapes glinting in the sun. A swarm of SBD Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise in Yorktown. They came in steep, screaming descents, sunlight flashing off canopies and wings as they dropped from the heavens like predatory birds. Admiral Nagumo barely had time to register what was happening. He had been informed of incoming American torpedo planes earlier, lumbering TBD devastators that had already been annihilated by his Zero fighters in a massacre that filled the sea with debris and smoke. He had exhaled relief then, believing the worst had passed. What he didn't know, what no one on the WWII yet realized, was that those torpedo squadrons had pulled the Japanese combat air patrol low to the ocean, leaving the skies above the fleet wide open. Now the Dauntless plunged almost vertically through the morning glare, their dive brakes whistling, pilots braced against the crushing G-forces. Below them, the carrier decks were chaos, fueled planes lined up wing to wing, bombs and torpedoes stacked on dollies, hoses snaking across the planks. It was the perfect storm of vulnerability. Lieutenant Richard Best, leading the dive from Enterprise, picked his target, Akagi. His gunner screamed coordinates as tracer fire streaked up from the ships below. Best ignored it. He lined up the red circle of the rising sun painted across the carrier's deck, exhaled, and released. The 1,000-pound bomb fell true, striking the flight deck just aft of the midline elevator and detonating in the hangar bay. The explosion was instantaneous and catastrophic. The blast punched through the wooden planking, igniting fuel lines and bombs stacked below. A sheet of flame tore through Akagi's interior. Men on the bridge were thrown to the floor, the air ripped from their lungs by the shockwave. On deck, sailors ran ablaze, their uniforms molten. Within seconds, secondary explosions began to ripple through the ship, aviation gas, torpedo warheads, munitions. To port, Kaga was hit almost simultaneously, 3 bombs striking in quick succession, each finding the most vulnerable points of her deck. Fuel-fed infernos erupted from open hangars. Pilots who had been climbing into cockpits seconds earlier were now tumbling into flames. The carrier's entire midsection bloomed upward like a volcano, and the superstructure disintegrated in a blast that tore through men and machinery alike. Further south, Soryu took 3 hits. Her hangar decks, crowded with armed and fueled aircraft, went up like a single, monstrous firecracker. Smoke rose thousands of feet into the sky, visible even to the crews aboard the American carriers far beyond the horizon. In less than 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's frontline carriers were aflame. the heart of the WWII, the pride of the Imperial Navy. The men aboard the fourth carrier, Hiryu, watched in stunned silence as the sea turned black with oil and fire. Admiral Yamaguchi, commanding from Hiryu, clenched his jaw, his knuckles white against the railing. The air smelled of burning paint, hot steel, and the sickly sweetness of aviation fuel. He gave a single order: prepare to strike. On the American side, the pilots climbed away, hearts pounding, engines sputtering with exhaustion and damage. Many could hardly believe what they saw below. The entire center of Japan's naval might engulfed in flame. Through cracked goggles, Lieutenant Best looked back once and whispered to his gunner, "We got them." By noon, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were burning wrecks. Explosions continued to shudder through their hulls. Some crews abandoned ship, others fought hopelessly with hoses and buckets, faces scorched and uniforms torn. Admiral Nagumo, dazed and silent, stood on the shattered bridge of Akagi until his staff physically pulled him away. His fleet, the one that had ruled the Pacific for 6 months, was dying beneath him. The sea was now a graveyard of men and machines, dotted with flaming oil slicks and drifting lifeboats. Japan's air arm, once unstoppable, was disintegrating before his eyes. Yet the horror was not finished. Hiryu, the last of the carriers, would launch her revenge, a strike that would cripple Yorktown and give brief, cruel hope before the inevitable end. On Hiryu's flight deck, Yamaguchi stood like a man staring into the jaws of destiny. Around him, sailors readied planes under the drifting smoke of their burning sister ships. They all knew what this meant. Japan could replace planes, but not carriers, not these. And as Yamaguchi watched the horizon blaze red, he understood something Nagumo could not yet admit. This was not just a defeat. It was the turning of the tide, the moment the Empire's dream began to die. By 2:30 p.m., the air above the Pacific was a blur of smoke trails and dying engines. The sun hung high, mercilessly bright, glinting off burning oil slicks and the twisted remains of aircraft scattered across the sea. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were all but gone, cracked, listing, their crews either dead or swimming through fire. But Hiryu, the last carrier of the WWII, still lived. On her bridge, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi stared into the haze, his face calm but pale beneath the streaks of soot. He had already received reports confirming the loss of the other carriers. Each name was a blow that landed silently, but with the weight of history. Still, he did not flinch. "Launch everything we have left," he said. His voice was low but resolute, cutting through the noise of the burning sea. Deck crews scrambled into motion, drenched in sweat and smoke. Mechanics pushed 2 groups of planes into position, A6M0s for escort and B5N Kates armed with torpedoes. The men worked with the mechanical precision of soldiers already dead in spirit, yet unwilling to surrender their final duty. One young pilot, barely 20, adjusted his flight goggles with trembling hands. "We will avenge Akagi," he whispered to no one in particular. By 3 p.m., Hiryu's strike force was airborne, a ragged formation streaking east toward the last known location of the American fleet. The sea below shimmered with black patches of oil. The horizon rippled with heat. On the Yorktown, Admiral Fletcher's lookouts spotted the incoming dots first, 12 aircraft in tight formation, coming in low from the northwest. Enemy bombers. Port bearing. The alarms sounded instantly, echoing across the ship. Crews ran to their stations. Anti-aircraft guns swung skyward, and the air filled with the bark of 5-inch shells and tracer fire. The Japanese planes came on fearlessly. American fighters rose to meet them, but the Zeros slashed through the interceptors with desperate ferocity. Bombs fell, one, then another, and Yorktown shuddered violently as explosions tore through her decks. Flames burst from the elevator shafts. Black smoke poured into the sky. For a moment, it seemed she might be finished. Damaged crews fought back with remarkable discipline, sealing compartments, dousing fires, tending to the wounded. The ship's captain, Elliot Buckmaster, refused to abandon her. "We can save her yet," he barked. And for a brief, defiant hour, it seemed he might be right. But fate was not done. At 5 p.m., another wave of Hiryu's aircraft, what few remained, came screaming in. This time, the hit was decisive. A torpedo slammed into Yorktown's starboard side, tearing open her hull and flooding her lower decks. The mighty carrier listed hard. Fires roared anew. The order was given: abandon ship. As the last survivors leapt into the darkening sea, they turned to watch the smoke curl from her decks, a pillar rising toward the same sun that now glinted off Japan's retreating planes. The Yorktown would not sink immediately. She would linger for days, scarred but afloat, before finally slipping beneath the waves. Yet her loss did not balance the scales. Japan had lost 4 carriers to America's 1, and more importantly, her finest aviators. Back aboard Hiryu, the radio crackled with reports. Yorktown heavily damaged, but still afloat. The relief on deck was mixed with disbelief. They had struck a blow, but it was not victory. Yamaguchi stood on the command platform, wind tearing at his uniform, staring out at the drifting smoke where his fleet had once been. "It is enough," he murmured. "We have done our duty." Moments later, American dive bombers from the Enterprise appeared over the horizon. They came swiftly and silently, dropping out of the sun just as their predecessors had that morning. There was no warning this time, no time to maneuver. Bombs fell like iron rain. At 5:03 p.m., Hiryu took 2 direct hits. The first punched through the flight deck, detonating near the hangar. The second struck aft, igniting torpedo stores. The entire ship convulsed in fire and thunder. Men were thrown into the sea. The deck twisted, the bridge erupted in sparks and smoke. Admiral Yamaguchi was offered a chance to abandon ship. He refused. Standing beside Captain Tomiokaku, he simply bowed. "Let us die with our ship." Both men remained on the bridge as Hiryu burned through the night, the flames reflecting off the waves like molten glass. When dawn came on June 5th, only wreckage remained. The once proud carrier drifted like a ghost amid blackened oil and shattered aircraft, her ensign still fluttering faintly in the breeze. At 8:20 a.m., the fires reached her magazines. The final explosion tore her apart. For the Japanese Navy, the sea was now silent. For carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, gone in a single day. Over 300 aircraft lost. More than 3,000 men dead. The greatest naval force in history had been annihilated in less than 24 hours. June 6, 1942. The Pacific Ocean was calm again, unnervingly calm. The great columns of smoke that had once marked Japan's proud carrier fleet had thinned into drifting ribbons of ash. The sea was littered with wreckage, broken planks, empty life vests, torn flags. Oil slicks stretched for miles, reflecting the rising sun like dark glass. The gulls had already arrived, circling over the debris in ghostly silence. On the deck of the battleship Yamato, hundreds of miles away, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat alone in his cabin, head bowed over the after-action reports. The paper trembled slightly in his hand, not from age or fear, but from the weight of comprehension. He read the numbers again: 4 fleet carriers lost, 1 heavy cruiser damaged, 248 aircraft destroyed, over 3,000 men missing or dead. His officers stood in silence, unwilling to speak. Outside, the ship's engines rumbled softly. The largest battleship ever built, armed with guns that could hurl shells over 20 miles, suddenly felt like a relic from another age, useless against the invisible reach of aircraft. Yamamoto finally spoke, his voice a rasp. "So it has happened. The war is lost." No one dared respond. In that moment, the great admiral, the architect of Pearl Harbor, the man who had once outwitted the United States with surgical brilliance, knew that Japan's empire had reached its zenith. The loss of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu was not just a tactical defeat. It was the death of Japan's naval air power, the very instrument that had carried the empire across the Pacific in a whirlwind of conquest. He knew that Japan could never replace what was gone. Each carrier had taken years to build, each pilot years to train. America, by contrast, could replace both in months. Even now, across the ocean, new carriers were sliding down the slipways in Virginia and California, while young pilots graduated weekly from training fields in Florida and Texas. Japan, with its limited resources and strained industry, could not keep pace. In Tokyo, the news arrived like a hammer blow. In the halls of the Imperial Navy General Staff, senior officers gathered in stunned disbelief. Some refused to believe the reports at all, insisting that Midway was only a temporary setback. Others stood frozen before the operational maps, staring at the empty spaces where the carrier's flags had been. The silence in those rooms was heavier than any explosion. When the Emperor was informed, the phrasing was careful, for carriers lost, not destroyed. But even that subtlety couldn't mask the truth. Japan's naval supremacy, once absolute, was gone. Across the Pacific, the Americans celebrated cautiously. At Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz received the victory report with the grim satisfaction of a man who understood what it meant. "This is only the beginning," he said, "but it is the turning point." He was right. The balance of power had shifted irreversibly. Japan's elite aviators, the men who had trained for years in secrecy and precision, were gone, lost with their ships. In their place, hurried recruits would fill the cockpits, brave but unseasoned. Meanwhile, the United States would flood the Pacific with ships, planes, and men at a rate no nation in history had ever matched. For the Japanese admirals who survived Midway, the realization came slowly, painfully. In the weeks that followed, survivors were picked up by passing ships. They spoke little. Some wept openly when they saw the rising sun flag flying over the rescue vessels, not from joy, but from shame. Others simply stared at the sea, their eyes hollow. One officer from Akagi later recalled, "When the flames reached the bridge, I thought I was seeing the death of Japan itself." Admiral Nagumo would never recover from the loss. He returned to Japan a broken man, his confidence shattered, his name forever linked to the disaster. Yamaguchi's decision to die aboard Hiryu became legend, a tragic symbol of loyalty amid defeat. But loyalty could not rebuild ships, nor resurrect pilots. As 1942 drew to a close, the Empire of Japan still controlled vast territories, from the Philippines to Burma. Yet beneath the surface, the tide had turned. Every Japanese admiral, every officer who had stood on those burning decks at Midway, understood a truth that could never be spoken aloud. The war was no longer about victory. It was now about survival. And on that quiet June morning, as Yamamoto placed the final report back onto his desk and stared at the map of the Pacific, he whispered a thought that would echo through history. "I fear we have awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible resolve."